My name is Alain Moreau. I am a journalist by trade, a photographer by heart, and perhaps more truthfully, a man trying to outrun the silence that often follows grief. I first arrived at the north rim of the Grand Canyon over a decade ago, in the summer of 2012, chasing a travel assignment that ended up chasing something inside me. Since then, the Grand Canyon Lodge became more than a summer retreat. It became a pilgrimage, a quiet confession. And every July, I returned, never exactly knowing why, only that I needed to. July 12th, 2025, began with a sunrise that almost made me forget the world was on edge. A veil of early morning mist drifted lazily over the towering pines, while the sandstone cliffs caught the first light like ancient sentinels igniting from within. The lodge, built from hand-hewn logs and native stone, stood like an old soul carved into the rim of eternity. From the wooden porch, I could see the yawning chasm of the transept canyon spread out before me, infinite and still. The air carried the cool sharpness of pine resin, and from the kitchen below came the comforting scent of baked sourdough and black coffee. Birds flitted between branches, and the breeze played a lazy symphony through the wind chimes, hanging by room 7A. I wasn't alone. A few early risers sipped quietly from steaming mugs, their silhouettes framed against the canyon's gold-lit expanse. I nodded to a familiar face. George, a retired park ranger in his 70s, who now volunteered as a nature guide. He raised his coffee in greeting. "You picked the right morning to be here," he said, voice low and warm. "I always come in July," I replied, smiling, a pause. "You feel it, don't you?" he asked. I didn't know what he meant. Something off, he said. The canyon's too still, the light's too soft, like the earth's holding its breath. I didn't answer. But deep down, I knew he wasn't wrong. There was a heaviness in the stillness, the kind you only recognize when it's too late. And that morning, as the sun rose over the canyon and painted the lodge in gold, I had no way of knowing. It would be the last time I saw this place whole. If this story speaks to you, even just a little, stay with me. What unfolded that day was more than a wildfire. It was a moment when memory, loss, and legacy collided. I'll take you there, through the smoke, the silence, and what remained. Have you ever witnessed something like this, where a place you love vanished in a moment? Share your story in the comments below. I'd love to read it. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon for the next chapters. Now, let's return to the last sunrise at the lodge. The wind changed by mid-morning. At first, it was barely noticeable, a subtle shift in direction. A cooler undertone carried through the branches. But by 10 a.m., the air had thickened. A high haze veiled the sky, dulling the sunlight and tinting the horizon with the faintest amber. The serenity of the morning began to feel staged, like a still frame in a film reel just before the reel burns. I wandered along a familiar trail that curved near the edge of the forest. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just following old instinct and perhaps a desire to escape the crowded porch. That's when I saw it. A thin column of smoke. It was distant, barely more than a thread against the backdrop of towering ponderosa pines. It spiraled lazily, too small to alarm. My first thought was, controlled burn. Or maybe some backcountry hikers lighting a campfire where they shouldn't. I turned back toward the lodge, but not before spotting a uniformed park ranger pacing the ridgeline with binoculars. He looked focused, but not panicked. "Smoke out near Dragon Creek?" I asked, approaching him. He lowered the binoculars and glanced sideways. Yeah, it's just a spot fire. Probably holdover from the 4th of July lightning storm. You're not worried? He exhaled through his nose. We've been monitoring it all week. It's inside the containment area. Nothing new. But as he spoke, a sharp gust cut between the trees and carried the smell of char. It wasn't the dry, distant kind. It was fresh, raw, like a match just struck against bark. Back at the lodge, life continued unbothered. The dining hall was setting up for the dinner buffet. Children chased each other between cabins. Tourists posed by the statue of Brighty the donkey, giggling as if the canyon had no memory, no danger. And yet, the animals knew. Above the canyon rim, a group of Steller's jays circled erratically, calling in shrill bursts before disappearing into the trees. I saw a mule deer, usually calm near humans, bolt across the lodge driveway, eyes wide, hooves clattering against stone. No one else seemed to notice, or maybe they chose not to. That night, I didn't sleep well. Something in the air had changed, not just the scent of smoke, but something more primal. The wind had grown restless. It whispered through the window cracks, rattling loose nails in the old lodge walls like fingers drumming on a coffin lid. I woke just after dawn to a sky that looked bruised. Ash fell in soft flakes outside my window, drifting like the first signs of winter. But it wasn't snow. It was warm. I stepped outside and felt it settle on my forearm like the breath of something dying. The air was dry to the point of pain. My nostrils burned. Even breathing felt like inhaling through burlap. Down by the front desk, I overheard a couple complaining that the smoke was making their eyes water and that they couldn't see the canyon clearly for photographs. One of the staff members, young, barely 20, offered them free coffee and a paper mask. "It's just temporary," he said, smiling nervously. "We've got everything under control." I wanted to believe him. But just then, a sharp wind swept across the lodge veranda, and a visible wave of dust and fine ash rolled across the floorboards like a low tide of soot. Children began coughing. One woman held a scarf over her face and muttered something in German I didn't quite catch, but the fear was unmistakable. I walked to the observation deck, my camera slung around my neck but forgotten. From there I could see the western ridge, smoke. Not a thread now, not a whisper, a wall, a low rolling wall of black and gray, roiling like a beast awakened from centuries of slumber. It was no longer out there. It was coming. Fast. A helicopter buzzed overhead. Its underbelly glinted in the pale sun as it banked sharply and disappeared into the canyon, trailing a bucket of bright orange retardant. That's when the realization hit me like a punch to the chest. They hadn't been trying to control the fire. They had been chasing it. I ran down the path to where a firefighter was adjusting his gear near the truck. His face was streaked with soot, and his eyes were red from smoke and fatigue. "How bad is it?" I asked. He didn't answer right away, just looked westward toward the smoke. "We had a plan," he finally muttered. "A confine and contain strategy. Let it burn through fuel naturally, inside a safe perimeter. And now?" He shook his head. "The wind shifted. That perimeter's gone." As if on cue, a low boom echoed across the canyon. Dull, distant, but unmistakable. Heads turned. Then came the sight. A plume of black smoke rising in a violent spiral, blotting out the horizon. People started to murmur. Some stepped back inside. Others rushed out, phones raised, filming what they didn't understand. I wasn't filming. I was watching. Feeling. The lodge had weathered many storms since it was first built in 1928. It had been reconstructed after fire once before, in 1932. But this felt different. This wasn't a lightning spark. This was a chain reaction. Century-old timber, drought-starved forest, suffocating heat. And now, wind. Fast, unpredictable wind. By noon, the sky was no longer blue. It had turned the color of rusted steel. The canyon looked like a charcoal sketch smudged at the edges, and the light had a sickly orange cast, like sunset at the end of the world. And still, there were no evacuation orders. Still, the guests were told it was under control, but nature doesn't obey press releases, and fire doesn't wait for clearance. By late afternoon, everything changed. The wind, once merely unpredictable, had become relentless. It howled through the pines like a chorus of warning, and with each gust, the smoke thickened, curling low over the lodge like a predator stalking its prey. Ash no longer drifted. It fell. Heavy. Relentless. Coating the wooden railings, crunching beneath boots, clinging to skin like guilt. Then we saw it. From the southern edge of Transept Canyon, a flicker of orange began to dance beneath the smoke, distant, like a match struck in a cathedral. It moved low and slow, creeping like something alive, licking at the underbrush. But within minutes, the flicker became a line. The line became a wall, and the wall moved forward, consuming everything in its path. Someone screamed. Guests began pouring out of the dining hall, plates left on tables, napkins still folded. On the lodge veranda, people pointed, not speaking. Some filmed with shaking hands, others just stared, paralyzed by a kind of awe that only comes when something sacred is about to be taken. The fire had crossed Transept Canyon. It was no longer a background threat. It was here. I remember the exact moment the lodge began to burn. It wasn't dramatic, not at first. Just a single crack, like the snapping of dry knuckles. Then a faint hiss as sap boiled inside timber. Smoke curled from beneath the rear eaves, where the old maintenance wing jutted out toward the rim. Then came the glow. Not from within the building, but from beneath it, from the forest floor below, where embers had crept unseen. The old wood, some of it nearly a century old, surrendered without resistance. Flames licked upward, bright and eager, dancing along the log walls like memories eager to be released. The smell was the worst. Not just smoke, but resin, varnish, history. 100 summers of pine oil and human sweat, of old postcards and love letters tucked in drawers. All of it igniting, turning to vapor, vanishing into a sky that no longer looked like the sky. The firefighters gave the signal to pull back. I saw them gesturing wildly, one drawing his hand across his neck in the universal sign, fall back, too dangerous. The wind had shifted again. No time to defend, only time to retreat. Bridie stood alone in the center courtyard. The bronze statue of the canyon's legendary donkey, Bridie of the North Rim, had always been a favorite photo spot. Children climbed on his back. Tourists patted his ears for luck. Now he stood stoic, surrounded by smoke, silhouetted against the fire like a ghost from another age. His form shimmered behind heat waves, and for a moment, he didn't look like bronze at all, but flesh, soul, memory. I raised my camera to take a picture and lowered it again. Some things shouldn't be captured. Some things are meant to be mourned. Around me, people had started crying. Not screaming, not running, just crying. Quietly. As if the destruction was too sacred for panic. The lodge wasn't just wood and stone. It was where people had proposed, laughed, wept, healed. A vessel for thousands of stories. And now it burned. The fire tore through the eastern cabins like paper, setting the night aglow before the sun had even set. I looked up. The sky above the north rim had turned the color of dried blood, and beneath it, the Grand Canyon Lodge, once so enduring, so eternal, collapsed in a wave of sparks and flame. The alarms came late. By the time the lodge's emergency sirens finally wailed into life, the sky had already turned black, not from nightfall but from smoke. The flames had reached the upper walkways, timbers cracked, groaned, then collapsed with sickening finality. "Everyone out! Now!" A voice cut through the chaos, one of the lodge staff, voice hoarse from shouting and smoke. But even his urgency couldn't fully cut through the disorientation. People were running in every direction. Some were crying, some screaming names. Others moved silently, in shock, clutching belongings that suddenly felt meaningless. Camera bags, travel guides, plastic souvenir cups. I tried to help a family with small children get to the main trail. The little boy clutched a plush bear, the fur already gray with ash. His sister cried for her backpack, left in the gift shop. Their mother pulled them forward, her eyes wild and red-rimmed. Then came the smell. It wasn't just wood smoke anymore. It was sharper, chemical. I caught a bitter sting in the back of my throat, and my lungs tightened like fists. "The water station!" someone shouted. "It's leaking!" The North Utility Facility, an old structure tucked into the hillside, had been hit by the fire. A rupture in the treatment tanks had released chlorine gas, colorless but heavy. It crawled across the canyon floor, invisible and deadly. The kind of gas that sinks into low places, clings to roots and rock. Waits. People began coughing violently. Some dropped to their knees. One elderly man fell hard on the gravel path, clutching his chest. I helped drag him toward a passing ranger vehicle, his breath wet and shallow. "We need to move!" a firefighter shouted. "It's coming down the canyon!" The designated evacuation route to Jacob Lake was now the only lifeline, smoke so thick, visibility dropped to arm's length. My camera was useless now, lens fogged with ash. Every step forward was blind faith. Along the way, I lost sight of George. He had been walking just behind me earlier, stoic as ever, his old ranger's hat pulled low, a bandana over his mouth. I had called out to him when the chlorine warning came. No answer. I scanned every group, every vehicle pulling out, every figure in the smoke, but he was gone. "George!" I called again, coughing into my sleeve. A woman beside me touched my arm gently. "We have to go," I hesitated. Every bone in my body screamed to turn back, to find him. But the canyon was closing behind us, flames curling over the ridgelines, trees snapping in half under the heat. We boarded one of the final shuttles heading north. Inside, people sat slumped, eyes glazed, skin smudged black and gray. A little girl stared out the window, watching the flames dance across the hill where she had collected pine cones that very morning. And then, just as the bus turned the bend, just before the lodge was lost from view, I saw it. A figure, alone, standing at the edge of the overlook. It looked like George, or maybe it was just my mind, playing tricks in the smoke. Then the canyon disappeared behind us, swallowed by flame and fog. We didn't speak much on the bus ride to Jacob Lake. The road was lined with the skeletal remains of pines, burnt black, some still glowing faintly from within like dying embers in a hearth. The vehicle bumped along the cracked pavement, headlights barely cutting through the smoky twilight. It was 3 p.m., but the sky had the weight and color of midnight. I sat by the window, forehead pressed against the cool glass, unable to look away. The lodge was gone. From our elevation, a quarter-mile up the ridge, I could see the entire north rim ablaze. What had once been meadows of deep green and golden grass had become a shifting, violent sea of fire. It moved with intelligence, searching, devouring, spiraling upward in plumes of flame taller than the tallest pines. There was no silence. The fire had its own sound. A low, thunderous roar that pulsed and surged with each gust of wind. Occasionally, the sound was broken by sharp cracks, trees snapping, propane tanks bursting, the final groans of collapsing roofs. I recognized the outline of the lodge, or what had been the lodge. Just an hour ago, it had stood proud, stone walls and timber beams holding stories from nearly a century. Now it was a silhouette of light and shadow, then nothing. The flames took it. They crawled up the walls, raced along the rafters, and wrapped around the tower like hands claiming what was never truly ours to keep. One final burst of sparks lifted into the dark sky like souls being carried away. A woman seated near me gasped, hand to mouth. Behind her, a small voice whispered, "Is that where we had pancakes?" The little girl from earlier, still clutching her bear, still watching. Her mother wrapped an arm around her but didn't answer. In my mind, I flashed back to that morning. Sunlight streaming through stained glass, the warm smell of coffee and pine, the laughter of hikers planning routes, the easy rhythm of a place that had survived generations. And now, it was being erased in less than 90 minutes. One of the firefighters sitting in the rear leaned forward. He looked exhausted. His gear was half off, his hands blistered and filthy. 97 years, he muttered. 97 years it stood. And now... He didn't finish the sentence. None of us could. Outside, a wind shifted and blew a wave of ash across the road, coating the bus windshield in a thin, gray film. The driver slowed. Everyone went quiet. I pulled out my camera, not to document the fire, but to capture what came after. A charred wooden beam, still smoldering, a fallen street lamp bent in half. A pair of hiking boots lying in the dirt, untouched by flame but left behind. These weren't images for news. They were memories in retreat. The fire wouldn't stop tonight. We all knew that. It would keep moving, fed by drought and wind, leaping canyon to canyon until it tired or ran out of fuel. But the lodge, that was over. There would be debates, investigations, finger-pointing. But nothing would change the simple truth. We had lost something we could never rebuild. Not truly. Not the stone. Not the timber. Not the echo of voices laughing by the fire after a long hike. What we had left were ashes and the long road away from a place we once thought was eternal. The shelter at Jacob Lake was a converted community center, normally quiet, used for town meetings or craft fairs. That night, it overflowed with silence and smoke-stained souls. People sat on cots and folding chairs, faces lit by the dull glow of emergency lanterns. Some stared into their hands. Others clutched phones, scrolling through the last photos they'd taken at the lodge just hours earlier. Photos that had already become relics. I found a seat near the back, beside a woman in a red flannel shirt, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her name tag said Miriam, housekeeping staff. We didn't speak for a while. Then she turned to me and said quietly, "I made beds there for 22 years. Knew every creak in the floorboards, even the ghosts." I raised an eyebrow. "There's a spot on the second floor," she continued, eyes distant. "Just outside room 214. Late at night you could hear footsteps, but no one there. We used to joke it was someone who never checked out." She smiled, then looked away. Her voice cracked. "I guess they're gone now, too." A few chairs over, a couple was holding hands tightly. I recognized them from earlier. Retired, well-dressed, both with the fragile calm of people who had seen too much too fast. I overheard the woman whisper, "We got engaged there. August 3rd, 1985. He hid the ring in a hiking boot." The man chuckled softly, eyes glistening. I almost forgot which boot. Their laughter was short. Not because the memory was gone, but because it now hurt to hold. All around me, similar fragments surfaced. A ranger who celebrated his daughter's first birthday on the lodge lawn. A family who had returned every summer since 2006 to scatter a grandmother's ashes near the overlook. A young man who showed me a photo of his late father taken on the lodge porch 10 years ago. Same spot where he'd stood that morning. No one mentioned the structure anymore. They talked about weddings, summer storms, guitar nights by the fire, about the wooden guest book in the lobby that held thousands of signatures, each one a small declaration. I was here. I mattered. This place knew me. It became painfully clear. The lodge was never just a building. It was a vessel for joy, for ritual, for memory. And now, all of that was suspended in smoke. Someone passed around water bottles and protein bars. A child handed me a crumpled drawing, stick figures in front of a tall, square house with orange flames above it. She had written in the corner, in shaky letters, "I miss the place where we made pancakes." I kept that drawing. Later that night, a few of us stepped outside for air. The sky was dark but still tinged with a red hue far in the distance. The fire had moved east, but the scent lingered. So did the heat, radiating faintly from the land like it remembered what had happened. Miriam lit a candle in a jelly jar and placed it on the curb. "For the ones who never left," she said. Others followed. Soon, a small line of candles flickered in the breeze. No speeches, no ceremony. Just light. Light that trembled, but did not go out. By the next morning, the smoke had reached the headlines. Phones began buzzing non-stop at the evacuation center. Social media exploded with aerial footage of the Grand Canyon Lodge in flames, taken by helicopters or rangers with long lenses. One image in particular went viral, a time-lapse of the lodge collapsing, beams curling inward like the ribs of a dying animal, fire exploding from within. The captions were mournful at first. Then they turned angry. Why wasn't it stopped earlier? How do you let a national historic landmark burn to the ground? Who signed off on confine and contain during record-breaking drought? The fire had a name now, Dragon Bravo Fire, sparked by lightning on July 4th, allowed to burn under controlled conditions, until the conditions weren't controlled anymore. and suddenly, everyone wanted answers. That afternoon, Arizona Governor Katie Hobbs held a press conference from Phoenix. She wore black and looked visibly shaken. "We have lost not only thousands of acres of forest," she said, "but a piece of our national identity. I am calling for an independent federal investigation into the decision-making process that led to this failure." The room applauded. Cameras clicked, but the damage was already done. I sat in a corner of the shelter, watching the broadcast with a dozen others. Some nodded, others scoffed. "She's just covering her tracks," someone muttered. "They always pretend to care after the flames." A retired fire captain, still wearing a soot-streaked shirt, stood nearby. His name tag read Mason, Hotshot Crew Lead. He crossed his arms and said bitterly, "We loved the lodge. Most of us spent our lives protecting it. But this time they told us, 'Let it burn.'" I turned to him. "They told you that?" He nodded. "It's called a monitor and manage strategy. Instead of fighting every fire, we let it clear out fuel in designated zones. In theory, it works. It saves resources, builds healthier forests." He took a breath. "But this wasn't the time. Not in this heat. Not with 40-mile-an-hour winds." "Why didn't they change the plan when the wind picked up?" "They did, but too late." Those last words stayed with me. Too late. A phrase that always arrives when someone has already lost everything. Later that evening, a local news station reported that nearly 5,000 acres had been burned. 50 to 80 structures destroyed, including cabins, staff housing, water, and gas utilities. The chlorine leak, confirmed by NPS, had forced an emergency retreat that cost firefighters precious minutes. And yet, officials repeated a familiar line. "No lives lost. All guests safely evacuated." Technically true, but incomplete. Lives aren't only measured in bodies. They're measured in homes, in legacy, in places where people became who they were. At dinner, someone passed me a folded newspaper. On the front page, a ranger crying beside a burned-out stump where the statue of Brighty used to stand. His caption read, "We thought the canyon was too big to burn." That night, I walked outside. The smoke had thinned, but the smell lingered, like a warning, like regret. I stared up at the stars, barely visible, and asked the question I'd been avoiding. Was this preventable? Was it climate change? A bureaucratic error? Or just nature reclaiming what it had loaned us? Maybe it was all of it. Maybe it didn't matter. But what did matter was this. We hadn't just lost a structure. We had lost a trust in the systems that promised protection. A trust in the idea that memory could be preserved in wood and stone. I thought of Miriam, the housekeeper, of George, who might still be lost, of the couple who had proposed in room 14, of a little girl drawing flames on paper and writing, "I miss the place where we made pancakes." And I thought of how fast it all went up. 97 years, gone in 90 minutes. I stayed. Most didn't. By the third day, the buses arrived to take evacuees south, toward Page, Flagstaff, or farther still. But something in me refused to leave. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was duty. Or maybe, like so many others, I simply didn't know how to say goodbye. At first light, I returned with a small group of volunteers, rangers, townspeople, former guests like myself, armed with gloves, shovels, and gallons of bottled water. The fire had moved on, smothered at last by air tankers and favorable wind. What remained was silence. The north rim had turned to charcoal. Trees stood blackened, like tall bones reaching into a cloudless sky. The ground, once soft with pine needles, now crunched with ash. Smoke rose faintly from fractured soil. The air still carried heat, not burning, but insistent, like a memory that refused to cool. And then we saw it. What used to be the Grand Canyon Lodge was no longer a place. It was a shape on the earth, a rectangle of char, half choked with twisted nails and broken stone. The massive hearth that once warmed generations had collapsed into itself, leaving only one jagged side standing, like a broken tooth in a mouth of soot. Miriam was there too. She knelt beside a half-buried door hinge and picked it up like a relic. Others wandered slowly, quietly, like pilgrims walking ruins of an ancient church. We didn't speak much. Instead, we worked. We cleared debris, hauled away fragments of metal, dug out embers still smoldering in pockets underground. A ranger found part of the guest book, burnt along the edges but intact in the center. Someone cried when they opened it and saw a line scrawled in green ink. Summer 2016, our first anniversary. We'll come back every year. A young boy brought water to the workers. His name was Leo. His parents had been guests. He didn't say much, just handed out plastic cups and asked if anyone wanted help. His shirt read, Junior Ranger in Training. Near the main steps, what was left of them, we built a small cairn of unburned stone. Not a monument, just a marker. People began placing things on it. A pine cone, a melted spoon, a scorched map, a photograph, half intact, of a family smiling in front of the canyon. By afternoon, someone had propped up a hand-painted sign. We remember. That evening, under an amber sky, a little girl walked up to the cairn. It was the same child from the evacuation shelter, the one with the drawing. She carried a small rock with her name painted on it. Sophie. She placed it on top of the pile and whispered something I couldn't hear. I didn't ask. Later, I took a walk around the perimeter. The canyon was still there, unmoved, unscarred. The fire had devoured what we built, but not what nature had carved over millions of years. Below, the Colorado River still shimmered like a ribbon of silver. The cliffs still held their deep reds and golds. The wind still moved, soft as breath. And for the first time since the fire, I felt something strange, something stubborn. Hope. Not the naive kind. Not the kind that promises everything will be okay, but the quieter version, the kind that lives in people who stay behind to sweep ashes, in a boy handing out water, in a girl placing a stone for the place she loved. That night, we lit candles again. Dozens now. Some in jars, some stuck in the dirt, some floating in tin pans. They formed a flickering line around the footprint of the lodge, like stars that had fallen to the ground and refused to go out. Miriam stood beside me and said softly, "We'll rebuild." I didn't answer, but I believed her. Maybe not the same lodge, maybe never the same. But something would rise again, not just in wood and stone, but in memory, in story, in the way strangers became family under an orange sky. The morning I left, the canyon was cloaked in mist. Not smoke, not ash, just a soft, silver fog that rolled gently across the rim, as if nature itself had paused to mourn. The air was still. The ground, warm beneath my boots, had begun to settle, though the occasional crackle of smoldering roots reminded us that fire, like grief, never truly ends, only quiets. I stood one last time at the overlook. The cairn we had built still stood, a fragile monument of stone and memory. Around it, the wind played with scraps of ribbon tied by passing hands. Someone had left a burned postcard, half charred, pinned under a smooth rock. The image on it, the lodge, framed by summer flowers, blue sky and the words, "Wish you were here." It hit harder than I expected. Behind me, the canyon stretched wide and quiet, not untouched, but unchanged in its essence. The rocks, the cliffs, the ancient breath of earth itself, still there. The lodge was gone, yes, but the place, the soul of it, still humming. I didn't say goodbye aloud. It didn't feel right. Instead, I walked the trail one final time. Past the scorched trees, past the melted signs, past the foundation stones where, once upon a time, laughter had echoed through pine-scented air and wooden walls had held the weight of memory. I paused near the spot where George used to give tours. I still didn't know what had happened to him. Some said he'd left with the first group of evacuees. Others whispered he'd stayed too long. But in my mind, I saw him standing tall, ranger hat pulled low, pointing toward the canyon as he always did. "This place doesn't belong to us," I remembered him saying once. "It only lets us visit." Back at the trailhead, I took out my notebook and wrote the final lines of my report. Not for any newspaper, just for me. The lodge has fallen silent, but for those who sat on its porches, who woke to its sunrises and dined beneath its rafters of stone and timber, it still speaks, in dreams, in smells, in the hush of canyon winds. Ash may fall, but memory does not. I tore out the page and tucked it beneath the rock where Brighty used to stand. The statue was gone now, melted in the fire. But the base remained, a scorched circle of stone, blackened, cracked, yet still holding its shape. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. Just off the path, lying in the dirt, was a small rectangle of paper, singed along the edges, corners curled. I picked it up carefully. It was a postcard, faded but intact. The image showed the lodge at sunset, bathed in gold. The words scrawled on the back were barely legible but still there. "See you next summer. Love, M." I didn't know who M was, but I understood. I placed the postcard back on the ground, gently, and stepped away. Then I walked down the trail, toward the waiting shuttle, the sky now clearing above me. One last look over my shoulder at the canyon, breathing quietly in the early light. A place we had borrowed. A memory we would never lose.